Right, let's talk about groups. People spend much of their lives in groups. Most people are born into families, which is a type of group. Once people hit a certain age, they join education groups such as specific preschool or kindergarten classes. Once in school, people join other groups such as particular friendship cliques, work groups, sports teams, and extracurricular groups such as student council and the debate team. Once out of school, people join groups and work organizations such as unions and business associations. People also form their own kin groups as adults by marrying and having children. Given that people spend a great deal of time during their lives in or in the presence of groups, social psychologists are very interested in investigating how groups function and perform. Also, since individuals often have to perform while in or in the presence of fellow group members, social psychologists are also interested in investigating how being in or in the presence of groups influences individuals' performances on certain tasks. Social psychologists are also interested in investigating why groups often have antagonistic relations toward one another, which we'll talk about in the next series of lectures. Now, although the term group is used to denote a variety of different types of social units, social psychologists define a group in a particular way. For social psychologists, a group has 5 characteristics. First, a group consists of 3 or more people. There is no such thing as a group of 1. There is no I in team, as they say. And 2 people in a relationship, such as a husband and wife or 2 lovers, are not technically a group, but rather a dyad. Second, a group exists when people interact with one another on a regular basis. If there is no interaction between people, there is no group, even if they are in close physical proximity to one another. Rather, it's just a set of people who happen to be near each other. Because regular interaction is necessary for a group to exist, groups tend to remain relatively small. When members of a group don't interact with every other member on a regular basis, you start to get to larger collectivities like formal organizations and status groups, or collectivities where membership is based on shared characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, or age group. That's why, for example, you never hear talk of black groups or Latino groups, but the black community or the Latino community, since it's virtually impossible for all blacks in the U.S., for example, to interact with each other on a regular basis. A third characteristic of groups is that all groups have shared goals. In fact, achieving goals is the reason that groups exist in the first place. Many goals are difficult or impossible to achieve without a group. It would be pretty difficult to play a recreational basketball league if one couldn't find 4 other people to join her team, and there is no such thing as a family of 1. Also, a group can often achieve a goal more efficiently and faster than an individual. This is because group members can divide the labor between each other to achieve its goals, whatever they may be. The goals a group tries to achieve can be practical, such as collecting donations for charity or trying to get others to vote for a particular political candidate. The goals can be social, that is, to simply socialize with people who share similar interests and attitudes, like forming a video game club or forming a friendship group of people who like to watch Bulls games at Buffalo Wild Wings. Of course, groups can have both practical and social goals, like many of the service sororities on campus where members both do activities for others and socialize with each other while doing so. Groups can have a single goal or they can have multiple goals. A charitable group may have the single goal of collecting money for charity, but another charitable group may collect money for charity but also collect clothes to give to the needy and run a resale shop. Groups are differentiated from one another by differences in goals. For example, a Dungeons & Dragons play group and a recreational basketball team can have the same exact members, but they would be considered two different groups because they would have two different goals. A fourth characteristic of groups is that all groups have shared norms. That is, there are expectations for how members are to behave in the group. Sometimes these norms are clear from the inception of the group. For example, there is the explicit norm, often written in a rule book somewhere, to play fair and show good sportsmanship in a recreational basketball group at the YMCA. Sometimes these norms emerge over the lifetime of the group. For example, friendship cliques in middle and high school often develop norms of dress, demeanor, and cultural tastes over their lifetimes that are not there at the beginning, but emerge during the lifetimes of these groups. And a fifth characteristic of groups is that all groups have members who share a sense of belonging to the group. That is, individual group members feel and think of themselves as actual members of the group. For example, if you were to go up to a member of a group and ask them about themselves, they would often tell you about the groups in which they belong. Also, members who belong to the same group feel emotionally close to each other because of their shared membership in the group. One of the biggest signs of a shared identity is when a group gives itself a name. Friendship cliques in middle school and high school often give themselves informal names. Fighting groups within militaries often give themselves a name, like the Fighting Joes. And organizations often give fancy titles to working groups within the organization to try to create a sense of shared identity amongst members. Sometimes groups even go so far as to create a physical symbol, a logo, if you will, for their group. A prime example of this, of course, are the Greek letters for all the Hellenic organizations on campus, but you also have logos for groups like Hell's Angels. To further understand what a group is, according to social psychologists, consider these two pictures here. The first is a picture of a few people waiting on a bus, and the second picture is of the Sinister Six, a group of Spider-Man villains that teamed up to kill Spider-Man. The people here waiting on the bus, even though there are more than two and they are in close physical proximity to one another, would not be considered a group. There is little to no social interaction between these people waiting on the bus. They share little to no norms. There is no shared sense of belonging amongst these bus riders. However, the Sinister Six is a group. There are more than two of them. They interact with one another on a regular basis. They have a shared goal, which is, of course, to kill Spider-Man. They have shared rules and norms, such as do anything you can to kill Spider-Man. And they have a shared sense of belonging to the group, which can be seen by the fact that they gave themselves the name of the Sinister Six. Now, almost everyone belongs to groups, and everyone has belonged to a group at some point in their life. Some of us belong to a few groups, some of us belong to many. But nevertheless, each and every one of you watching this lecture here belongs to some sort of group. But why do we belong to the groups that we belong to? Well, three reasons. First, we belong to the groups we belong to because of accidents of birth, geography, and social location. For instance, most of you belong to the family group that you do because you were born into it. It was not your choice. And your family lived in a particular place, which determined what educational groups you would belong to, because where you live in the U.S. often determines where you will go to school. And it also helped determine the friendship groups you formed, since we are more likely to form relationships with people close to us in physical proximity. You were born into families of particular social locations, and that also helped determine what groups you ended up belonging to. If you were born into a wealthy family, you might have formed a tennis group with other kids at a local country club. But if you were born into a not so wealthy family, you might have formed a stickball group with kids from the neighborhood. I could go on, but the big point here is that many of the groups that we actually belong to are determined by factors that we don't have much control over. Second, we belong to the groups that we do because we need to create and or join these groups so that we can achieve many of the goals that we want to achieve. We join a Dungeons and Dragons group because we want to have fun, a fun way to relax. We join a service sorority because we want a way to help others. We join a study group because we want a way to get a good grade in a particular course. We create a family group through marriage or cohabitation so that we can start a family. Third, we belong to the groups we belong to because of the evolutionary need to belong to groups. Humans seem to have an innate tendency to want to associate with other people. In other words, there are few actual hermits. This is most likely because belonging to groups helped early humans survive in the ancestral environment through mutually sharing resources and providing protection from predators. Because of this, early humans who preferred to belong to groups were more likely to survive and pass on this tendency to the humans that live today. Now, a quick look around can reveal that groups vary in how long they last. Some groups only last for a few weeks, others last months, others years, some decades. What's the cause of this variation? Well, how long a group persists over time is determined by a group's cohesion, which refers to the overall set of forces that act on group members to remain members of the group. There are five major forces of group cohesion. The first, and perhaps the strongest, is group accomplishment. In general, groups that actually achieve their goals are more cohesive than those that don't actually achieve their goals. This makes sense from a motivational standpoint. No one wants to stay in a group that keeps failing. For example, a charity group that actually meets its fundraising goals is more likely to stay together than a charity group that doesn't. Perhaps for the simple reason that people like to associate themselves with successful others. Since cohesive groups are more likely to achieve goals because they work together better, there is sort of a feedback loop between goal accomplishment and group cohesion. That is, goal accomplishment increases group cohesion, increased group cohesion increases the probability of accomplishing goals, and so on. Sort of starts a virtuous cycle, as they say. There is a caveat, however. Goal accomplishment can decrease group cohesion if the goals are one-off or finite. For example, even if a student group, work group in a college course successfully accomplishes its tasks, the group will probably not endure because the goal that brought them together is completed. Of course, the group could add another goal, like just hanging out, to maintain itself. Many groups, though, have goals that are indefinite and thus avoid group dissolution through group achievement. Many charity groups remain over time because there's always people in need, no matter how successful a charity group is at its work. A second force of group cohesion is attraction to fellow group members. Groups where members like and have positive emotional attachments to each other are more cohesive than groups where members don't like each other too much, nor have positive emotional attachments to each other. What causes liking or positive emotional attachments can be anything like similarity, shared interests, and familiarity. It also includes achieving goals. Achieving goals creates positive emotional attachments between group members. A third force of group cohesion is stringent barriers to entry, or basically when it is hard to become a member of the group. Groups that have stringent barriers to entry usually require potential members to go through costly, difficult, harsh, humiliating, and sometimes dangerous rituals and ceremonies to become a true member of the group. For example, potential fraternity and sorority members often have to perform humiliating and sometimes dangerous tasks to become true members. Members of many religious groups often have to go through some sort of difficult training process to become a true member of the group. And some groups charge monetary fees to join, and sometimes they can be quite large. Groups that have stringent barriers to entry tend to be more cohesive than groups that anybody can join. This is because of the justification of effort effect that you learned about earlier in this course. When people have to go through a lot of pain, suffering, and cost to achieve something, they often come to like that something because this is how people justify going through all this pain, suffering, and cost. A fourth force of group cohesion is costly barriers to exit. It is quite costly to leave some groups. These costs can be financial, goal-oriented, or social. For example, leaving a project group at one's job might involve losing one's job. Leaving a project group in one's college class might result in one failing the course. And leaving a religious group might involve losing many friends who remain in the religious group. A fifth force of group cohesion is conflict. Conflict with other groups often makes a group more cohesive. When a group conflicts with another group, the bonds between members often strengthen because they have something in common, namely an enemy. In fact, the cohesiveness of many groups is largely due to the group having a perpetual rival. The cohesiveness of street gangs is largely because most street gangs have a direct rival group. And the cohesiveness of high school cliques is often due to having a direct rival group. Now, many groups have leaders, whether informal or formal, and whether given from the beginning of the group or arising in the course of interaction amongst group members. Most groups have a person or a particular set of people who act as the leaders of the group. And leaders definitely influence the performance of a group. Leadership is the process where one member or subgroup of members influences and coordinates the behavior of other members in the pursuit of a group goal. Leaders have authority or the ability to issue orders that others will follow. Without authority, a leader is just a leader in name only. For instance, if an army general can't get his troops to follow his orders, the general is a leader in name only. Only a general whose orders are followed can really be considered a leader. Group members become leaders either through authorization or endorsement. Group members become leaders through authorization when they are chosen by individuals with high status in the group. For example, the manager at a McDonald's is an authorized leader because he or she is chosen by the restaurant's owners. On the other hand, group members become leaders through endorsement when they are chosen by members of equal or lesser status in the group. Elected officials in the U.S. are endorsed leaders because they receive their leadership positions through the votes of the general public. Group members usually have to grin and bear, so to speak, authorized leaders. This is because they often can do nothing to get rid of them, since they've been put in positions of leadership by higher ups. Any person who has worked for a terrible, incompetent manager can attest to this. Endorsed leaders, however, can lose their leadership status. For example, incompetent elected officials are usually voted out of office. And research finds that endorsed leaders usually lose their leadership status for two main reasons. The first reason that endorsed leaders lose their status is if the group constantly does not achieve its goals. A little bit of failure is acceptable at first, but too much failure will usually call for a change in leadership. The second reason is when the leader acts very negatively toward other group members. Since endorsed leaders are put there by the people, so to speak, the people don't have to deal with an endorsed leader's negative behavior for too long. They can simply put in another leader. Now, many people believe that some people are simply born good leaders. That is, many people believe that some people are born with personality traits and characteristics that just makes them good leaders. History books often portray successful leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte and Abraham Lincoln in this way. However, social psychologists find little evidence that people are born good leaders. There is no evidence that any personality traits or personal characteristics influence who will be good leaders and who will be bad leaders. For example, one person collected data on 100 attributes and characteristics of U.S. presidents to see if any of these predicted success in office. And he found that only 3 variables, height, family size, and books published, correlated strongly with how effective a president was while in office. He found absolutely no personality traits that predicted whether a person would be a good or bad president. Because no one is born a good leader, that means that whether a person is a good leader or not is contingent on situational and contextual factors. To describe these situational and contextual factors and how they influence leadership ability, social psychologists have developed the contingency theory of leadership. And according to the contingency theory of leadership, the effectiveness of leaders depends on 2 interrelated factors. First, how task-oriented or relationship-oriented the leader is, and 2, the favorableness of the situation for the leader. The first factor that determines the effectiveness of leaders is how task-oriented or relationship-oriented the leader is. Task-oriented leaders are leaders who are more concerned with getting the job done than with group members' feelings or with maintaining good relationships. These are your no-nonsense leaders that keep their eyes on the prize, so to speak, and really don't care if group members' feelings get hurt in the process. Relationship-oriented leaders, on the other hand, are leaders who are concerned primarily with group members' feelings and relationships. These leaders focus a lot of their time and energy to make sure that everyone in the group gets along and doesn't have hurt feelings, sometimes to the detriment of achieving the group's goals. The second factor that determines the effectiveness of leaders is how favorable the situation is for the leader. And there are 3 things that influence whether the situation is favorable or unfavorable for a leader. First, a situation is favorable for a leader when the leader has positive relations with other group members. When fellow group members don't like the leader, this is an unfavorable situation. Second, a situation is favorable for a leader when the task to be accomplished is highly structured. When the task isn't very structured, the situation is unfavorable to a leader. Some tasks are very structured, such as framing a house using architectural blueprints. In these cases, the situation is favorable to the leader. What you have to do is written right there on the page. Other tasks, however, are very unstructured, such as slashing a budget or coming up with ideas for an advertising campaign. In these cases, the situation is unfavorable to the leader. Third, a situation is favorable for a leader when the leader has a lot of power to make a decision. However, the situation is unfavorable to a leader when she doesn't have a lot of power to make a decision. Leaders who have a lot of power can tell people what to do and can expect these commands to be followed. For instance, an army general tends to have a lot of power. She says jump, the soldiers say how high. Leaders who have little power, though, have to get people to do things through bargaining and pleas. This may be the case for a leader of a work group in a college classroom, for example. Overall, then, a situation is highly favorable for a leader when the leader has positive relationships with fellow group members, when the task is highly structured, and when the leader has lots of power. A situation is highly unfavorable for a leader, however, when the leader has negative relationships with group members, when the task is unstructured, and when the leader doesn't have a lot of power. Now, according to the contingency theory of leadership, whether a particular person is an effective leader depends on the combination of whether she is task-oriented or relationship-oriented, and whether the situation is highly favorable or unfavorable to the leader. As this graphic here indicates, task-oriented leaders are most effective in situations that are either highly favorable or highly unfavorable, but are mostly ineffective in moderately favorable situations. However, relationship-oriented leaders are most effective in moderately favorable situations. Task-oriented leaders are more effective when conditions are very unfavorable because in these conditions, groups often need strong leaders that focus exclusively on achieving the group's goals. Because relationship-oriented leaders focus too much of their energy on hurt feelings and on maintaining positive relationships between group members, they are relatively ineffective at helping the group actually reach its goals. But in very favorable conditions, task-oriented leaders can focus on relationships. In other words, task-oriented leaders can become relationship-oriented. When everybody's getting along and things are running smoothly, social psychologists find that relationship-oriented leaders are, though, however, useless and actually start to become too bossy and thus ineffective. Relationship-oriented leaders are most effective in moderately favorable conditions because problems between group members are more likely to arise in these conditions, and relationship-oriented leaders are best able to handle these problems. Because conditions aren't highly favorable or unfavorable in modern conditions, task-oriented leaders find it hard to balance trying to reach the group's goals with smoothing out interpersonal relationships in the group. Now, an interesting thing about groups is that they often, even despite themselves, form what we call status hierarchies. A status hierarchy is when some members of a group are more valued, have more power, and are treated with more deference than other members of the group. Even groups that start out being overly democratic and wanting members to be more or less equal end up forming status hierarchies. The development of status hierarchies is important for how groups function and perform, since those with the most power and prestige in a group have the greatest ability to shape the goals and the direction of the group. Status hierarchies arise due to status generalizations, which is when group members' personal and social characteristics influence how much power and prestige they have in a group. Status generalization occurs because of stereotypes people have about people of particular personal and social characteristics. Because of stereotypical cultural beliefs about how some types of people are better at certain tasks than others, for example, that men are better at math than women, or about the overall ability of some types of others. For example, those with southern or urban accents are not as intelligent as those with Midwestern or West Coast accents. These beliefs cause members to believe that certain people will simply be better at certain tasks than others, even with no evidence. Thus, group members are using what they believe about people with particular characteristics to make decisions about who should lead the group and be in charge, rather basing these decisions on actual evidence or ability and leadership capability. Group members often combine the various personal and social characteristics of other members to determine their status in the group. For example, consider a black man. Since he is a man, people will think he is better at a math test than a woman, since most people hold the stereotype that men are just better at math than women. However, because he is black, people will think he is worse at math than a white person, because many have the stereotype that whites are more intelligent than blacks. In this case, people will put this person in sort of an intermediate status position, higher than what one characteristic would have him in, but lower than what another characteristic would have him in. Status generalizations are most likely to occur when, one, members of the group have no prior history, And 2, members have no information about other members other than their personal and social characteristics. This makes sense, of course. When people have nothing to go on but their stereotypes, they will use those stereotypes to make decisions. Remember, one of the functions of schemas is to help people make inferences. However, if people have information about people on their abilities, this information will often cancel out the effects of stereotypes. For example, if there are an equal number of men and women in a group, if members don't know anything about each other than they will often defer to the men of the group. However, if members learn that one of the female members has a PhD in mathematics, they will begin to defer to her. The upshot of all this is that group members get put in charge of the group less because of their actual competence and more because of their perceived competence. Of course, this can lead to suboptimal group performance because the wrong people are basically put in charge of the group. That's why when you first form a group, you should get to know one another as much as possible. You should do the dreaded "tell me about yourself" introductions, because these will often inform you and other members of each other's talents and experiences. And you can use this information rather than stereotypes based on personal characteristics and social statuses to decide who should lead the group and who should do what in the group. Now, as I mentioned several times already, part of the reason groups exist is to achieve particular goals. A quick look at groups reveals that some groups are better at achieving goals than others. We know that some sports groups are better at achieving their goals of winning than other sports teams. And many of you have probably seen some work groups in class do better than others on class presentations than other groups. So, what explains this variation? Well, 2 things. 1, how difficult it is to achieve a goal, and 2, the type of goal a group is trying to achieve. The first factor that influences a group's achievement of its goals is the difficulty of achieving a goal. When the goal is easy for a member to achieve, the presence of group members actually improves performance. However, when the goal is hard for a member to achieve, the presence of group members decreases performance because of evaluation apprehension, which hopefully you'll remember is the fear of being negatively judged by others. For example, consider an experiment where the researchers had a team of 4 college students observe several different pool players from a distance until they found the ones who were experienced players, or those that made at least two-thirds of their shots, and novices, those who made less than 1/3 of their shots. The 4 researchers then walked up to the tables and watched both the good players and the bad players play. And as you can see from this graph, the good players made significantly more shots when they knew they were being observed than when they didn't know they were being observed. But the opposite trend happened for the bad players. They made more shots while nobody was watching than when they knew people were watching. So whether you some people get better when people watch at a test, and that's because they're usually very good at it and they kind of want to show off. But if you're just okay or not that very good at a task, you actually become worse at the task. More people are watching because it makes you nervous about messing up, right? You know that people are watching. It takes away cognitive energy and your concentration and things like that. The second factor that influences a group's ability to achieve its goals is the type of goal the group is trying to achieve. And there are 3 types of group goals: additive goals, conjunctive goals, and disjunctive goals. An additive goal is a goal where individual group members' contributions are summed up to produce the total group output. A good example of an additive goal is trying to push a stalled car. The more people push with all their might, the easier the car is to move. A disjunctive goal is a group goal in which the group's performance depends on its strongest or most capable member. A good example of a disjunctive goal is a game of trivia. When playing in groups, the trivia team that usually performs the best is the best individual trivia player. A conjunctive goal is a group goal in which the group's performance depends on its weakest or least capable member. A good example of a conjunctive goal is the offensive line of a football team blocking for a quarterback or a running back. An offensive line is only as good as its weakest member, because the weakest member allows defenders to come through the line and sack the quarterback and doesn't block very well for the running back. Social psychologists find that as the number of individuals in a group increases for an additive task, the more likely social loafing will occur. Social loafing is when individuals in a group don't contribute as much as they possibly could to accomplishing a group task. For example, in one of the earliest social psychology experiments ever done, a social psychologist asked participants to pull as hard as possible on a rope that was attached to heavy weights, and he used a gauge to measure the amount of pull exerted. The participants in the study either worked by themselves or as members of a group. And the results show that although a group of 8 men could pull harder overall than a small group or a single individual, the average contribution of members declined as the size of the group increased, as you see here. So basically, the more people were pulling, the lazier people got. They didn't pull as hard as they really could because other people were pulling. Right? Social loafing is less likely to occur when 3 factors are present. First, social loafing is less likely to occur when group members see their contributions as unique. When people don't think that their individual contributions to the goal will be noticed, they will often slack off because, again, they don't think their individual contributions will be noticed. Second, social loafing is less likely to occur when individual group members benefit from the outcome of the group's goals. When group members believe that they will ultimately benefit from the group's goals, they are less likely to slack off than when they don't think they'll benefit all that much. Third, social loafing is less likely to occur when individual group members value the group. When people like the groups that they belong to, they are less likely to slack off than when they are emotionally neutral or have negative feelings about the group. Bigger groups, however, also decrease group performances in conjunctive tasks. This is because as the size of the group increases, so does the probability of getting a weak or incompetent member. Since groups trying to complete conjunctive tasks are only as good as their weakest link, the greater the number of people in the group, the more likely the group will have a weak link. For example, let's say that you have 2 groups competing with one another with the goal of answering a series of math questions. The members of the 2 groups answer the questions separately, and a group can only win when each member has gotten every question correct. In this case, a group with just a few members would be more likely to win than a group with many members. The group with many members may have many people good at math, but they also may have a lot of people who are not so good at math, thus dragging their performance. On the other hand, bigger groups increase group performances for disjunctive tasks. This is because as the size of the group increases, so does the probability of getting a member who is very good at the task. Since groups trying to complete disjunctive tasks are as good as their strongest member, the greater number of people in the group, the more likely the group will contain a strong member. For example, let's say that you've got two groups competing in a trivia contest, and only one person from the group has to get the answer right for the group to score points. In this case, a group with many members would be more likely to win than a group with just a few members. The more members a group has, the more likely they will have someone who's very good at trivia and can carry the group, so to speak. This isn't the case, though, for a group with a few members. Groups often have to make decisions about how they are going to go about achieving their goals. And there's an old adage that two heads are better than one. And there's a lot of truth in that statement. Multiple people can often offer different ideas and criticisms than just one person. And this often leads to better decision making overall than when a single person has to make a decision on her own. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes groups make decisions that seem like the worst decisions a group could make in hindsight. But at the time, the groups believed that this decision was the absolute best one to make, even the only one they can make. And such groups suffer from what's called groupthink. Groupthink is a faulty mode of thinking by group members in which their desire to realistically evaluate decisions is overwhelmed by pressures for unanimity within the group. There are many examples of groupthink leading to negative consequences in the history of the world, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion during the Kennedy administration, the Challenger explosion in the 80s, the most recent Iraq war implemented by the last Bush administration, and most likely Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. Groupthink causes groups to do a number of things that lead them to make bad decisions, such as not thinking about possible alternatives to solving a particular problem, not fully examining the risk of a particular decision, and failing to come up with a contingency plan or plan Bs in case their decision turns out to be wrong. Symptoms of groups suffering from groupthink. One symptom is illusions of invulnerability. This is when group members think that they are invulnerable and cannot fail, and therefore display excessive optimism and take excessive risk. When Putin announced that he was invading Russia, he said it would probably be about a week and they would be done. Another symptom of groupthink is illusions of morality. This is when members believe that their group is morally superior to other groups, and this belief may incline them to ignore the ethical consequences of their decision. Putin justified his invasion of the Ukraine by saying he was going to get rid of all the corruption and Nazism that supposedly plagued Ukraine. Another symptom of groupthink is collective rationalization. What this means is that members may discount warnings that, if listened to, would cause them to reconsider their assumptions about the problem, and thus their solutions about the problem. So, it is well known that Putin just surrounds himself with yes men. Stereotyping the adversary is another symptom of groupthink. The group may develop a stereotyped view of their enemies as too evil to warrant genuine attempts to negotiate, or as too weak to mount effective counteractions. This especially occurs in the political realm. Again, they, whether they believed it or not, they did stereotype the government of Ukraine, Putin did, as full of Nazis, and he probably thought the current leader of the Ukraine was weak and would fall easily because he literally was an actor who was elected to the post. Self-censorship is also a symptom of groupthink. This means that members may not express their own doubts about what the rest of the group thinks in order to seem like they are with the group. Yet another symptom is pressure on dissenters to conform to the group. When a group experiences groupthink, fellow group members may exert a great deal of pressure on dissenters to go along with the group. And again, it's very well known that Putin, that strange accidents happen to a lot of people who disagree with Putin. Mind garden is another symptom of groupthink. When a group experiences groupthink, self-appointed mind guards often emerge. These are members who protect against information that might shatter the complacency about the effectiveness and morality of the group's decisions. Again, Putin has a bunch of yes men around him, making sure that he gets information he wants to hear and doesn't get information he doesn't want to hear. Finally, perceived unanimity among group members is another symptom of groupthink. This means that even though group members may have doubts, everyone believes that everyone but themselves believes that the decision is the correct one. Now, not all groups experience groupthink. Rather, there are several particular environmental and group characteristics that cause groupthink. Often, groups that experience groupthink experience several of these environmental and group characteristics at the same time. One cause of groupthink is high levels of group cohesiveness. This is a cause of groupthink because the more cohesive the group, the more no one wants to rock the boat, so to speak, and disagree with the decisions the group has made. Again, it is known that Putin surrounds himself with yes men and people who have been extremely loyal to him throughout his political career. Another cause of groupthink is homogeneity of members, or when all the members of a group are alike. This is a cause of groupthink because similar others often share the same values and beliefs, and thus there are no dissenting voices in the group. I believe all of Putin's inner circle are old white men, who were probably used to be KGB agents. Insulation of the group from the larger environment is another cause of groupthink. When groups lose touch with the real world, so to speak, they are more susceptible to groupthink. This is because the real world has facts and opinions that would temper the decisions groups might make when they experience groupthink. The lack of clear-cut rules to guide decision-making is another cause of groupthink. Without these clear-cut rules, groups often end up deciding on a course of action that is at the extremes of what a group with clear-cut rules would choose. And it doesn't seem that there's any clear-cut rules of whether to engage in military combat on the part of Russia other than whether Putin decides to or not. Another cause of groupthink is high levels of group stress. This is a cause of groupthink because groups in high stress situations become more cohesive, and they often think that they have to make a decision immediately. And decisions made hastily are often not the best ones. And finally, promotional leadership is another cause of groupthink. Promotional leaders are leaders of a group who have a lot of authority and promote a particular type of solution to the problem. Groups with promotional leaders are more prone to groupthink because no one in the group wants to go against the decision they believe the leader wants. And if there has ever been a promotional leader, it is Vladimir Putin. Now, groups that suffer from groupthink can implement bad decisions. And these decisions can often have a great deal of negative ramifications for other people, especially when the group making the decision has a lot of power. For instance, the Bush administration's decision to go to war with Iraq was probably caused by groupthink, as was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And going to war can negatively affect many individuals in a number of ways, as I hopefully don't have to tell you. Now, because of the negative implications of decisions made by groups experiencing groupthink, social psychologists have come up with several ways people can avoid groupthink. One way to discourage groupthink is to encourage dissent among members of the group. By doing this, both the positive and negative aspects of a decision will come out into the open, and those groups are less likely to make a decision because they believe that it is the best and only decision that doesn't have any negative consequences. Another way to discourage groupthink is for leaders to be impartial and not announce a preference for any decision. In other words, groups shouldn't have promotional leaders. When a leader is trying to make a decision, he or she shouldn't tell the other group members whether he or she initially believes what the best course of action is to take. Doing this will make other group members feel comfortable expressing views that are contrary to what the leader actually believes, since they don't know what the leader actually believes. Dividing groups into subgroups and deliberating independently is another way to avoid groupthink. This helps prevent any premature consensus amongst group members, thus preventing any sense of unanimity in the group. Second chance meetings are another way to avoid groupthink. This is where the group sets up additional meetings after the choice is made for anyone to voice any disagreements or concerns about the decision made before the decision is implemented. Doing this gives group members a last chance to voice their opposition, and that can influence the ultimate decision made. Another way to avoid groupthink is to appoint a group member to the position of a devil's advocate, or someone whose main purpose is to come up with criticisms of other people's ideas. This allows the potential flaws in a decision to be voiced in a structured way, thus allowing members to know all the potential consequences and drawbacks of a decision. Finally, another way to avoid groupthink is to seek outside and/or anonymous opinions about the decision made. This allows group members to know about potential drawbacks to their decisions that perhaps they don't know about. Okay, so that is the lecture on groups. Next set of lectures which will be your last lectures, we'll discuss when groups conflict with one another. Bye-bye.